What if a queen, the legitimate heir to one of the world's most powerful empires, was locked away for 46 years? What if the men in her life, her husband, her father, and her son all claimed she was insane? And what if the evidence for her madness was simply that she felt things too deeply? That she was jealous, that she grieved, that, she had a temper. Could a woman's emotions be used as a weapon to strip her of her crown, her freedom, and her children? The story of Juana of Castile is often told as a tragedy of a mad queen, but maybe it's not a story about madness at all. Maybe it's a story about power, ambition, and one of the longest, most successful gaslighting campaigns in history. Number 16. Why was her story written by her captors? The Marquis of Denia, Juana's jailer for over 30 years, received a letter from his master, Emperor Charles V. The letter, dated 1518, gave a clear order. He was to make sure no one spoke to the queen. He was to prevent her from writing or receiving any letters. Her reality was to be completely controlled. This was not about care, it was about containment. The history we have of Juana was written by the very people who held the keys to her cell. Her son, Charles V, and her father, Ferdinand of Aragon, had every reason to portray her as mentally unfit. Their own power depended on it. Think about who benefited from the Juana the Mad narrative. It wasn't Juana. It was everyone else. Ferdinand of Aragon needed to rule Castile as regent after his wife Isabella died. The official story: he was stepping in to help his poor, unstable daughter. Without her madness, he would have been a usurper. He would have been stealing power from the rightful queen, but with her madness, he became a dutiful father, a responsible statesman saving the kingdom from chaos. He controlled the reports that came from the court. He commissioned the chronicles. He made sure the official record matched his political needs. Every outburst Juana had, every moment of despair, was documented and exaggerated. Every moment of lucidity was ignored or downplayed. Then came her son Charles. He arrived in Spain from Flanders in 1517, a stranger who barely spoke the language. He needed the legitimacy that came from his mother. He was king only through her. But he did not want to share power. He certainly did not want a strong-willed mother questioning his decisions, so he continued the narrative his grandfather had started. He kept her imprisoned in the same dreary palace in Tordesillas. He kept the same jailers. He maintained the same strict isolation. The official correspondence of his reign refers to her condition as a settled fact. It was a convenient truth that allowed him to rule one of the largest empires the world had ever seen, unburdened by the actual queen. The people who wrote the history books were employed by these men. Chroniclers like Lorenzo de Padilla and Prudencio de Sandoval wrote accounts that solidified the image of a hysterical, irrational woman. They had access to the official court records that were carefully curated by Ferdinand and Charles. They interviewed people who owed their careers to the king and emperor. It would have been professional suicide to write a history that suggested Queen Juana was sane and had been wrongfully imprisoned. Their job was not to find the objective truth. Their job was to create a historical record that justified the actions of their patrons. We have very few words from Juana herself. Her letters were intercepted. Her personal accounts were not preserved. We see her almost exclusively through the eyes of men who had a vested interest in her being powerless. They described her jealousy of her husband Philip, but they framed it as unhinged obsession, not as a natural reaction to his constant and public infidelity. They described her profound grief after his death. They called it necrophilia and madness, not the deep sorrow of a woman who, despite everything, had loved her husband and was now truly alone in a court full of sharks. The narrative served a political purpose. It solved a succession crisis. It justified the rule of two ambitious men. And it was incredibly effective. For centuries, the story of Juana la Loca was accepted without question. It was a romantic, tragic tale. It was easier to believe in a mad queen than to confront the chilling reality of what was done to her. The story stuck because it was simple, it was dramatic, and it was the only story allowed to be told. The truth of Juana's state of mind was buried under 46 years of imprisonment and centuries of carefully constructed propaganda. Her captors didn't just lock her body away, they locked away her voice too. Number 15 was her madness, just a woman's passion. Juana was born in 1479. Her mother, Isabella I of Castile, was one of the most powerful rulers in European history. She was intelligent, determined, and famously pious, but she also had a fierce temper and was known for her passionate displays of emotion. Her father, Ferdinand, was a shrewd political operator. In the world they inhabited, a man's anger was a sign of strength. A man's ambition was a virtue, but the rules for a woman, even a future queen, were different. A woman's passion was a sign of instability. Her anger was hysteria. Her ambition was a dangerous flaw. Let's look at the specific behaviors that were used as proof of Juana's insanity. The primary accusation was her overwhelming jealousy regarding her husband, Philip the Handsome. Philip was, by all accounts, charismatic and relentlessly unfaithful. He carried on numerous affairs, often openly, with the ladies of their court in Flanders. Juana reacted with fury. There are accounts of her confronting his mistresses, of screaming at him, of cutting off the hair of one of the women. Is this a sign of madness, or is it the desperate, angry reaction of a young woman who is publicly humiliated by her husband? In a political marriage where her very position and the security of her children depended on her husband's loyalty, his actions were not just personal betrayals, they were political threats. A modern therapist might diagnose her reaction as a perfectly understandable response to emotional abuse and infidelity. But in the 16th century, a woman, a queen, was expected to tolerate such behavior with quiet dignity. Her refusal to do so was labeled as an imbalance of the mind. Another key piece of evidence was her profound grief following Philip's death in 1506. She refused to be separated from his coffin. She ordered it opened multiple times to look at him. She traveled with his body for months across the Castilian countryside. This behavior is, without a doubt, unusual. But was it madness? Consider the context. Juana was in a hostile country. Her husband, the father of her children, and her main political ally against her own father was dead. She was surrounded by Castilian nobles who were loyal to her father, Ferdinand. She was pregnant. Traveling with Philip's body was a powerful political statement. It constantly reminded everyone that he had been the king consort and that she, his widow, was the rightful queen of Castile. Prevented her enemies, including her father, from seizing his body and burying it, symbolically burying his influence along with it. It was a macabre but effective way of holding on to power and asserting her legitimacy during a moment of extreme vulnerability. It was a desperate political act, repackaged by her enemies as a morbid obsession. Her other symptoms were periods of melancholy, a refusal to eat, and a lack of interest in her personal appearance. Today, we would call this depression. And she had every reason to be depressed. She was isolated in a foreign land. Her marriage was a disaster. Her children were being used as political pawns, and the men in her life were actively plotting to take her power. And depression is a response to trauma and circumstance. For Juana, it was not a sign of an inherent mental defect. It was a sign that she was a human being suffering under immense and prolonged pressure. The standards for a queen were impossibly high. She was expected to be pious, demure, and fertile, yet also strong enough to command respect. Juana was intelligent, well-educated, and by all early accounts, a capable and strong-willed princess. But her passion, her refusal to quietly accept betrayal was her undoing. The very traits that might have been admired in a king, a fiery spirit, a deep emotional capacity, a stubborn insistence on his rights, were the very things used to declare her insane. Her tragedy was not that she was mad. Her tragedy was that she was a passionate woman in a world that had no place for a passionate queen. Number 14. Why did the rebels believe in her sanity? In the year 1520, a massive revolt broke out in Castile. It was called the Revolt of the Comuneros. The cities of Castile rose up against the new king, Charles V. They saw him as a foreign ruler who was bleeding their country dry, using Castilian money to fund his ambitions to become Holy Roman Emperor. The rebels needed a leader. They needed a legitimate Spanish ruler to rally behind, and they knew exactly where to find one. They marched to Tordesillas. They went to the palace where Queen Juana had been imprisoned for over a decade. They believed she was the true queen, and they believed she was sane enough to lead them. This is perhaps the most compelling evidence we have for Juana's lucidity. The leaders of the revolt, men like Juan de Padilla and Juan Bravo, were not fools. They were risking their lives and the future of their cities. They would not have bet everything on a woman they believed to be hopelessly insane. They met with her. They spoke with her at length. According to the accounts from the Comuneros themselves, they found a queen who was intelligent and coherent. She listened to their grievances against her son. She understood the political situation perfectly. She spoke with authority about her rights as queen. For a brief period, Juana was free. The rebels removed her jailer, the hated Marquis of Denia. They treated her with the respect due to a monarch. They asked her to sign documents officially siding with them and legitimizing their cause. This was her moment. She could have taken her revenge on Charles, the son who had kept her locked away. She could have seized power for herself and rewritten her own story. And she considered it. She negotiated with the rebels. She showed a keen political mind, weighing the options. But in the end, she refused. She would not sign any document that would lead to a civil war against her own son. She condemned his government and his advisors, but she would not take up arms against her own flesh and blood. This was not the act of an irrational madwoman. It was the complex, heartbreaking decision of a mother and a queen trapped between her duty to her people and her loyalty to her family. A mad person would not have been capable of such nuanced political calculation. A mad person would not have held the fate of a kingdom in her hands, deliberated and made a conscious, principled choice. Her decision was ultimately catastrophic for the rebels, who were eventually crushed by Charles's forces. But it demonstrates a mind that was working, a conscience that was clear, and a will that was still her own. After the revolt was put down, Charles's men retook Tordesillas. The Marquis of Denia was reinstated. And the story was immediately twisted. Charles's chroniclers claimed that Juana had been confused and manipulated by the rebels, that she didn't understand what was happening. They had to say that. Because if they admitted the truth that the rebels saw her as sane, that she was capable of leading, and that she chose not to out of principle, it would completely undermine the justification for her imprisonment. The Comuneros revolt is a window that opens for a few short months, letting us see a different Juana from the one her captors described. We see a woman who was respected, who was politically astute, and who was, in the eyes of those who sought her as a leader, perfectly sane. Number 13, how was religion used to control her? Juana was the daughter of Isabella I of Castile, a monarch so famously devout she was known as Isabella the Catholic. But Juana was raised in an environment of intense, unwavering piety. Her faith was a core part of her identity. And her captors knew it. They understood that controlling her religious life was a powerful way to control her mind and her behavior. It became one of the cruelest tools of her long imprisonment. Her jailer at Tordesillas, the Marquis of Denia, used access to the sacraments as a form of reward and punishment. If Juana was compliant, if she ate her meals and did not rage against her confinement, she might be allowed to attend Mass. If she was defiant, if she refused to cooperate or demanded to be treated like a queen, this privilege was taken away. For a woman of her time and upbringing, being denied the ability to attend Mass or receive confession was a profound spiritual torment. It was a way of telling her that she was not just a prisoner, but a sinner, cut off from God's grace. It was a lever to create immense psychological distress. The Marquis of Denia wrote letters to Charles V detailing his methods. He reported on Juana's religious state as if it were a symptom of her illness. He claimed she had heretical tendencies. He said she was not behaving like a good Catholic. These accusations were incredibly dangerous. In 16th century Spain, the time of the Spanish Inquisition, an accusation of heresy could have terrible consequences. It was a way to isolate her even further. If people believed she was not only mad, but also a bad Christian, no one would dare to support her. There are accounts of Juana resisting this manipulation. She sometimes refused to confess to the priests sent by her jailers, suspecting, likely correctly, that they were spies who would report everything she said back to the Marquis. She would argue with them, showing a sharp theological mind. Her resistance, her refusal to be a passive participant in their religious control, was then used as more proof of her instability and her impiety. It was a perfect trap. If she obeyed, she was controlled. If she resisted, she was mad and heretical. This religious pressure reached its peak in her final years. There are reports that her confessor, a man who later became St. Francis Borgia, was one of the few people who treated her with kindness and saw her clearly. He seemed to recognize her suffering for what it was, but others continued the torment. There were attempts to perform exorcisms on her, suggesting they were trying to frame her psychological distress as demonic possession. It was the ultimate gaslighting. They were not just telling her she was crazy, they were telling her she was evil, that her soul was in peril, and that her only salvation lay in complete submission to their authority. By controlling her access to the very faith that had structured her entire life, they could inflict a level of mental anguish that is hard to fathom. They took the most personal and profound part of her being and twisted it into a weapon against her. This was not the action of people trying to care for a mentally ill relative. This was the calculated strategy of captors determined to break the will of their prisoner. Number 12, why was she kept from her own children? Juana had 6 children. They were the future of the Habsburg dynasty: Eleanor, Charles, Isabella, Ferdinand, Mary, and Catherine. They were all taken from her. This systematic separation was not an accident. It was a deliberate strategy to break her spirit and remove any potential allies. A queen with her children by her side has a power base. A queen alone is just a prisoner. When Juana and Philip first traveled to Castile from Flanders in 1502, they left their eldest children, Charles and Eleanor, behind. This was a political decision meant to maintain Habsburg influence in the Low Countries, but it was the beginning of a lifetime of separation. After Philip's death and her subsequent confinement, her son Ferdinand, who had been born and raised in Spain, was taken from her care by her father. The elder Ferdinand wanted to raise his grandson himself, to mold him and perhaps even use him as an alternative heir to the foreign-raised Charles. But Juana was left with no say in her own son's upbringing. The most heartbreaking case was that of her youngest daughter, Catherine. Catherine was born in 1507, shortly after her father Philip's death. She was an infant when Juana was imprisoned at Tordesillas in 1509, and she was imprisoned with her for nearly 2 decades. Catherine was Juana's only constant companion. But she was not a comfort. She was a fellow prisoner. The Marquis of Denia, their jailer, was instructed to keep them in a small, dark set of rooms, often with the windows boarded up. He reported that Catherine was a great relief to the queen, but his letters also reveal that he used the child as another tool of control. He could threaten to take Catherine away if Juana did not behave. Imagine being a mother, watching your child grow up in a prison. And Catherine had no playmates. She had no education beyond what her mother could provide. She was dressed in black, a mirror of her mother's permanent mourning. The world knew her as the Infanta of Tordesillas. When Juana's son, Charles, finally came to Spain, he was shocked by his sister's condition. But his solution was not to free his mother. His solution was to remove Catherine in 1525, to marry her off to the King of Portugal. Juana, who had already lost 5 children to the machinations of politics, now lost the only one she had ever truly known. Reports say she was utterly devastated, her grief immense. Her captors would have pointed to this as another sign of her instability, rather than the natural reaction of a mother whose last child was being torn from her arms. The separation served a clear purpose. Without her children, Juana was isolated. She could not influence them. She could not build a faction around them. Charles, growing up in Flanders, knew his mother only as a distant, abstract figure, the Mad Queen whose name gave him the right to rule Spain. He felt no personal loyalty or affection. It made it easy for him to continue her imprisonment when he came to power. He saw her not as his mother, but as a political problem to be managed. By keeping them apart, the men who ruled in Juana's name ensured that the next generation would have no reason to question the official story. The family bonds that could have saved her were severed before they could ever truly form. Number 11. Who controlled the queen's money? Juana was the Queen of Castile. In her own right, she was one of the wealthiest individuals in the world. The Kingdom of Castile, enriched by the early spoils of the New World, was a source of immense revenue. Juana should have had control over vast sums of money, palaces, and lands. She should have had the power of patronage, the ability to reward her supporters and build loyalty. She had none of it. Her wealth was completely controlled by her father and later her son. Like this financial control was a critical part of her imprisonment. Power in the 16th century was tied directly to money. A monarch needed money to pay for armies, to maintain their court, to fund their government. By denying Juana access to her own funds, Ferdinand and Charles rendered her politically impotent. She could not hire her own staff. She could not pay for soldiers loyal to her. She could not send ambassadors or even communicate with potential allies because she could not pay the messengers. She was a queen in name, but she had the financial autonomy of a pauper. The household at Tordesillas was funded by an allowance, a budget set and controlled by her captors. The Marquis of Denia was in charge of all expenditures. He decided what food she would eat, what clothes she would wear, how many servants she would have. His letters to Charles V are filled with complaints about the cost of maintaining the Queen's household, always framing it as a burden. He controlled every detail. If Juana wanted something, she had to ask her jailer. This created a dynamic of total dependence. It was infantilizing. It stripped her of the last vestiges of her royal authority. This financial abuse was disguised as responsible management. Ferdinand and Charles argued that because of her illness, she was incapable of managing her own affairs. It was a circular argument. They claimed she was mad, so they took her money. And because she had no money, she had no power to challenge their claim that she was mad. She was trapped. There are stories of her trying to assert what little control she had. Sometimes she would refuse to sign documents or approve expenses. One of the few ways she could resist. These acts of defiance were, of course, presented as further evidence of her irrationality and stubbornness. They said she was being difficult, that she did not understand matters of state. But it's more likely that she understood perfectly. She understood that her signature was one of the last bits of power she possessed, and she was not going to give it away for free. By controlling the purse strings, Ferdinand and Charles ensured Juana could never mount a comeback. Any noble who might have considered supporting her knew that she had nothing to offer them. There were no titles, no lands, no gold she could promise. All the rewards flowed from Ferdinand and Charles. Loyalty followed the money. The systematic financial stripping of Queen Juana was not an act of care. It was a cold, calculated political strategy to ensure she remained a queen on paper, but a prisoner in reality. Number 10. Did her own son continue the betrayal? Charles of Ghent was born in 1500. He grew up in Flanders, far from his mother and from Spain. He was raised by his aunt, Margaret of Austria, and his education was overseen by advisors who saw Spain as a source of funds for their European ambitions. He did not meet his mother until he was 17 years old. By then, she had already been a prisoner for 8 years. For Charles, his mother was not a person. She was a concept, a legal key that unlocked the throne of Castile. When Charles arrived in Spain in 1517 to claim his inheritance, he went to Tordesillas to meet Juana. This was a critical moment. He was her son. He had the power to free her. He could have ended her confinement, restored her to a position of honor, and ruled jointly with her. He did the opposite. After their meeting, he concluded that the stories were true, or at least that it was convenient for them to be true. He issued orders confirming her imprisonment. He reappointed the same jailer, the Marquis of Denia, who had served his grandfather Ferdinand. The betrayal was now complete. It had passed from father to son. Charles's motivation was pure politics. He wanted to be the sole ruler of Spain. He needed his mother's title, but not her presence. To justify this, he needed the world to believe she was mad. He wrote letters to the Pope and other European rulers explaining his mother's unfortunate condition. He maintained the strict information blackout around Tordesillas. He ensured that Juana remained a non-person, a ghost who haunted the Spanish throne. His treatment of her was, in some ways, even more calculated than his grandfather's. Ferdinand's actions were born of a direct power struggle. Charles's actions were colder, more bureaucratic. He was solidifying his own imperial power, and his mother was a loose end to be tied up. He visited her only a handful of times over the next 4 decades. These were not visits of a loving son. They were inspections. He needed to ensure she was secure, that she was not causing problems, and that the narrative of her madness was being properly maintained. The official story was that he was acting out of filial duty, protecting his mother and the kingdom. But his actions show a different reality. He used her name on official documents to give them legitimacy. Laws were passed in the name of Queen Juana and King Charles, but he never allowed her to see them. He kept her daughter Catherine with her as a companion/hostage for years, only to remove her when a politically advantageous marriage presented itself with no regard for his mother's emotional state. Charles built one of the greatest empires in history. He was the Holy Roman Emperor, the King of Spain, the Lord of the Netherlands, the ruler of a vast overseas empire. All of it was built on a foundation that required his mother to be powerless and silent. He never wavered in his decision to keep her imprisoned. Even at the end of her life, as she lay dying in 1555 after 46 years of confinement, she was still his prisoner. Her son, one of the most powerful men in the world, owed his entire Spanish inheritance to her. He repaid her by ensuring she never experienced a single day of freedom after he came to power. Number 9, what really happened inside the Tordesillas convent? In 1509, by order of her father Ferdinand, Queen Juana was taken to a small, grim palace in the town of Tordesillas. The palace overlooked the Duero River. It was a former royal residence, but it was chosen not for its comfort, but for its security. This was where Juana would spend the next 46 years of her life. It was not a sanctuary, it was a prison. What happened inside those walls was a systematic process of psychological demolition orchestrated by her jailer, the Marquis of Denia. The Marquis, Luis Ferrer, was utterly loyal to Ferdinand and later to Charles. His job was simple: keep Juana isolated and under control. He was given almost total authority over her life. He controlled who she saw, what she ate, and when she was allowed to leave her rooms. For long periods, Juana and her young daughter Catherine were confined to a set of rooms that had no view of the outside world. The windows were often boarded up. They lived in a state of perpetual twilight. This sensory deprivation was a deliberate tactic to disorient and depress her. The staff of the household were not loyal servants of the queen. They were spies for the Marquis. Every word Juana said was reported back to him. Every mood swing, every moment of anger or despair was documented in his letters to the crown. These letters formed the official record of her madness. In this environment, Juana had no one to trust. Any kindness could be a trick, any conversation a betrayal. This constant state of suspicion would be enough to unravel even the most stable personality. The Marquis of Denia also used force. When Juana resisted, he was not gentle. He wrote about using a certain pressure to make her comply. Later in her life, during a period of deep depression and defiance, there are reports from her own granddaughter that the Marquise's wife and daughters would physically restrain the queen, tying her to a chair to force-feed her. These were not medical treatments, these were acts of control meant to break her will. She was denied any connection to the outside world. She received no news of the kingdom she was supposed to be ruling. She was not allowed to read letters, not even from her own children. She was a queen who knew nothing of her own realm. Her world shrank to the size of her darkened rooms and the faces of her jailers. The goal was to make her forget. She was a queen, to make her forget the world outside, until her prison became her entire reality. Despite this, there were moments when her spirit broke through. She raged against the Marquis. She demanded to be treated with respect. She refused to eat or sleep, using the only form of protest available to her control over her own body. Each of these acts of defiance was twisted and reported as a symptom of her insanity. Her fight for dignity was framed as a descent into madness. For 46 years, this was her life. A slow, grinding process of isolation, manipulation, and control. The convent at Tordesillas was not a place of healing. It was the place where the story of Juana the Mad was manufactured day by day for nearly half a century. Number 8. How did her father seize power again? When Philip the Handsome died suddenly in Burgos in 1506, it created a massive power vacuum in Castile. Juana was the undisputed queen, but she was a grieving widow, pregnant, and surrounded by nobles with shifting loyalties. Her father, Ferdinand of Aragon, was in Naples at the time, securing his own kingdom. The news of his son-in-law's death was not a tragedy for him. It was an opportunity. It was his chance to get back the power he had lost. After Isabella's death in 1504, Ferdinand had tried to hold on to power in Castile, but the Castilian nobles were wary of the Aragonese king. They had backed Philip and Juana, forcing Ferdinand to retreat to his own kingdom of Aragon. Now, with Philip gone, the board was reset. Ferdinand immediately began plotting his return. He used the stories coming out of Castile about his daughter's extreme grief as his justification. He spread the word that Juana was too unstable to rule. He presented himself as the only one who could bring stability to the kingdom. The famous journey with Philip's coffin played directly into his hands. Juana's slow, morbid procession across the winter landscape of Castile was seen by many as bizarre. While Ferdinand and his agents made sure to amplify this view, they didn't portray it as a political act of a queen trying to hold her ground, but as the hysterical wanderings of a deranged woman. This narrative was crucial. It allowed Ferdinand to position himself not as a power-hungry monarch, but as a concerned father and a responsible statesman intervening for the good of the realm. He made a deal with his grandson Charles's guardian, the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian. They signed a treaty that appointed Ferdinand as the regent of Castile during Juana's illness. He had international backing. Then he returned to Spain in 1507. He met with his daughter. By all accounts, the meeting was tense. And Juana was not a passive victim. She resisted. She refused to hand over power, but she was in an impossible position. She had no army, no treasury, and few powerful allies left in a court that Ferdinand now controlled. Ferdinand acted swiftly. He dismissed anyone in the court who was loyal to Juana. He installed his own men in all key positions. And then he made the final move. In 1509, he ordered that Juana be taken to Tordesillas. He chose the location, and he appointed her jailer. He effectively had the rightful Queen of Castile and Leon placed under house arrest. Once she was behind those walls, he had complete control. He ruled Castile as its regent for the rest of his life, all in the name of his incapacitated daughter. His seizure of power was a masterclass in political maneuvering, built on a foundation of character assassination. He didn't need to defeat his daughter on the battlefield, he just had to convince the world that she was mad. Number 7 was the journey with the coffin, a political statement. The story is one of the most famous and bizarre in royal history. After her husband Philip died in September 1506, Queen Juana refused to let his body be buried immediately. Instead, she began a journey that lasted for 8 months, traveling with his lead-line coffin across the Castilian plains. They traveled mostly at night because she supposedly said that a widow who has lost the son of her own soul should not travel in the light of day. She had the coffin open several times so she could look upon his face. This image of a grieving queen unable to part with her husband's corpse has been used for centuries as the ultimate proof of her madness. But was it really that simple? Let's look at the situation from Juana's perspective. She was in Burgos, a city whose nobles had been loyal to her husband. His death was sudden. There were even rumors that he had been poisoned, perhaps by agents of her father, Ferdinand. Juana was now the sole ruler of Castile, but she was incredibly vulnerable. She was pregnant. She was surrounded by powerful men who saw her as a pawn in their own games. Her father was in Italy, but he was already making moves to return and claim the regency. She had to assert her authority, and she had to do it quickly. The body of a king was a powerful symbol. Where the king was buried had huge political significance. If Philip were buried in Burgos, it would give the nobles there a claim to his legacy. If his body was taken by her father's faction, they could use it for their own purposes. By keeping the coffin with her, Juana kept control of that symbol. She was the queen, and the body of her late king consort was with her. It was a constant visual reminder to everyone she encountered that she was the center of power. The journey was also a way to secure the kingdom. She was not wandering aimlessly. She was moving from one town to another, showing herself to her people as their queen. It was a royal procession, albeit a strange one. It was a way of staking her claim, territory by territory. She was also trying to get to Granada, the burial place of her mother, Isabella. Okay, to bury her husband alongside her mother would have been a powerful statement, linking Philip's Habsburg dynasty with the Trastamara dynasty of Castile and legitimizing her children's claim to the throne. And why travel at night? The official story is romantic and morbid, but there might have been a practical reason. A large royal procession moving during the day would have been a slow and obvious target for her enemies. The traveling at night may have been a security measure. The order that no women were allowed near the coffin was seen as a sign of her jealous obsession, even in death. But it was also a rule of the monastic order that accompanied the procession. Her grief was undoubtedly real and profound. But it is possible and even likely that she channeled that grief into a series of calculated political acts. The journey with the coffin was not just an emotional breakdown. It was a desperate and unconventional strategy by a queen without an army, without a treasury, and without allies to hold onto her crown. Her enemies saw an opportunity to label her mad, and history, for the most part, has accepted their version of the story. Number 6, who first locked her away and why. The first person to imprison Juana was not her father or her son. It was her husband, Philip the Handsome. The incident happened in Flanders, in their court in Brussels, long before they returned to Spain to claim her throne. It was a prelude to everything that would follow. It established a dangerous precedent that Juana's behavior could be used as a justification to restrain her and remove her freedom. The conflict arose from Philip's blatant infidelity and his political ambitions. Juana was deeply in love with him, but Philip saw their marriage primarily as a stepping stone to power. He was not interested in being a faithful husband. When Juana discovered one of his affairs and reacted with a furious, jealous rage, Philip did not see it as a marital dispute. He saw it as a political problem. A hysterical wife was an embarrassment that could undermine his authority. In 1504, after a particularly intense confrontation, Philip had Juana confined to her rooms. He placed guards at her door. She was, for all intents and purposes, a prisoner in her own palace. She was the daughter of the powerful Queen Isabella of Castile, but in her husband's court, she was powerless. This was a shocking act. He was not just locking up his wife, he was locking up the heir to the Castilian throne. Why did he do it? He did it to control her. Her emotional outbursts were a challenge to his image and his power. By imprisoning her, he was sending a clear message he was in charge. He was also beginning to build a narrative. And he started telling people that his wife was emotionally unstable, that her temper was a sign of a deeper mental affliction. It was a useful excuse. It explained away his own bad behavior. Of course, she was upset, she was unbalanced, and it also laid the groundwork for his future political plans. News of this reached Juana's mother, Queen Isabella, back in Spain. Isabella was horrified. She wrote angry letters to Philip, demanding that he treat her daughter with the respect she deserved. She even sent her own ambassador to investigate the situation, but the distance was too great. Isabella was old and sick. She could do little to protect her daughter from so far away. This first imprisonment showed Philip that he could get away with it. He learned that he could use Juana's emotions against her. He could reframe her legitimate anger as madness and use that as a justification for controlling her. It was the first step in the gaslighting campaign that would define the rest of her life. It taught Juana a terrible lesson as well, that her husband, the man she loved, would not protect her. In fact, he was her first jailer. Number 5, did her father want her to fail? Ferdinand of Aragon was a brilliant political strategist. He and his wife, Isabella, had united the kingdoms of Aragon and Castile, completed the Reconquista, and funded Columbus's voyage. They were a formidable team, but when Isabella died in 1504, that partnership ended. The crown of Castile passed not to Ferdinand, but to their daughter, Juana. For a man who had been a king his entire adult life, becoming a mere king consort in his wife's kingdom, and now being pushed aside in his daughter's, was unacceptable. From the moment of Isabella's death, Ferdinand's primary goal was to maintain control over Castile, and his own daughter was the main obstacle. Ferdinand knew Juana well. He knew she was intelligent and strong-willed. He also knew she was emotionally volatile and deeply in love with her husband, Philip. He used this knowledge to his advantage. He engaged in a subtle but relentless campaign to undermine her. He saw that her marriage to Philip was a source of conflict. Instead of trying to help his daughter, he exploited the situation. He knew that the more conflict there was between Juana and Philip, the more unstable Castile would seem, and the more the nobles would look to him, the experienced old king, for leadership. He played a double game. Publicly, he was the concerned father. Privately, he was maneuvering to isolate Juana. When Juana and Philip came to Spain to be crowned, Ferdinand's relationship with his son-in-law was one of open hostility. They were rivals for power. This put Juana in an impossible position, torn between her husband and her father. Any stress or anxiety she showed was noted by Ferdinand's supporters and used as evidence of her weakness. After Philip's death, Ferdinand's path was clear. He had to be regent. To do that, he had to prove that his daughter was incapable of ruling. He didn't just passively accept the stories of her madness. He actively cultivated them. His agents at court sent him detailed reports of her behavior, which he then circulated. He ensured that the governing council of Castile was filled with men loyal to him. He systematically stripped away her support network. There is a telling moment when Juana was resisting his attempts to take power. She told him that her mother had left her the kingdom, and she intended to rule it. Ferdinand's response was not to reason with her. It was to have her declared legally incompetent, and then to have her locked away. His actions were not those of a father trying to help a troubled child. They were the actions of a political rival eliminating the competition. He needed Castile for its wealth and its military power to support his own ambitions in Italy and against France. Juana's well-being, her freedom, and her rights as queen were secondary to his strategic goals. He didn't just watch her fail. He made sure of it. Number 4, what did her mother's will truly say? Her Queen Isabella I of Castile died on November 26, 1504. Her last will and testament was one of the most important political documents of the era. It confirmed that her daughter, Juana, was her rightful heir and successor as Queen of Castile. But it contained one crucial clause, a passage that would be used to destroy Juana's life. The will stated that if Juana should not want to or could not govern, then her father, Ferdinand, should rule as regent in her place until her son, Charles, came of age. What did could not govern mean? The language was dangerously vague. Did it mean physical inability? Or did it mean mental incapacity? This ambiguity was the legal loophole that Ferdinand, and later Charles, would exploit to its fullest. It gave them a legitimate sounding pretext for seizing power. They didn't have to formally depose Juana. They just had to convince people that the conditions of this clause had been met. Why would Isabella include such a passage? She was a shrewd and loving mother. It's unlikely she wanted to disinherit her own daughter. The most probable explanation is that she was genuinely worried. She had been receiving reports from Flanders about the volatile state of Juana's marriage to Philip. She knew her daughter was unhappy and under immense stress. She had also seen a history of mental health struggles in her own family. Her own mother, Isabella of Portugal, had suffered from a deep depression and had lived in isolation for many years. Isabella may have included the clause as a protective measure, a safety net, to ensure the stability of the kingdom if Juana was truly overwhelmed. She likely trusted her husband, Ferdinand, to act in Juana's best interest, but she underestimated her husband's ambition. In Ferdinand's hands, this protective clause became a weapon. He didn't need to prove in a court of law that Juana was insane. He just needed to create a political consensus that she could not rule. He used the reports of her jealousy, her public arguments with Philip, and her later grief as the evidence. He presented them to the Castilian Cortes, the parliament, and argued that the conditions of Isabella's will had been fulfilled. The will was a masterpiece of political foresight on Isabella's part, but it had a fatal flaw. It relied on the good faith of the people who would interpret it. In the hands of men who prioritized power over family, the document that was meant to secure Juana's inheritance became the legal justification for her lifelong imprisonment. It was the key that locked her cell. Juana was not declared insane by doctors or judges. She was declared incapable by her own father, using her own mother's words against her. Number 3 was her husband, the first to call her mad. Philip of Habsburg, known to history as Philip the Handsome, was Duke of Burgundy when he married Juana in 1496. He was young, charismatic, and ambitious. The marriage was a political alliance designed to encircle France. But from the beginning, there was a clash of personalities and expectations. Juana, raised in the austere and devout Spanish court, fell deeply in love. And Philip, a product of the more liberal Burgundian court, saw the marriage as a duty and continued his life of pleasure-seeking and infidelity. This was the seed of the conflict that would lead to the first accusations of madness. When Juana's siblings and nephew died, she unexpectedly became the heir to the throne of Castile. Suddenly, Philip was not just the husband of a princess, he was on the verge of becoming the king of Castile. His ambition soared. He wanted to rule Castile himself, not just as a consort to his wife. But to do that, he had to sideline Juana. He needed to convince the powerful Castilian nobles that she was not fit to rule, and that he should be the one in charge. He began a subtle campaign to paint her as unstable. He used her jealousy, which his own behavior provoked, as evidence. He would complain to his courtiers and to foreign ambassadors about her melancholy and her passionate nature. He framed her reactions to his infidelity not as the understandable anger of a wronged wife, but as the irrational fits of a crazy woman. This was gaslighting in its most classic form. He was creating the problem and then blaming her for her reaction to it. The situation escalated when they traveled to Spain in 1502. Philip was bored by the stiff Spanish court and eager to return to Flanders. Juana, who was pregnant, wanted to stay in her homeland with her parents. Their conflict became a public spectacle. Philip decided to leave without her. Juana was distraught, leading the public scenes of distress. Philip and his supporters used this. They sent reports back to Flanders, describing her as hysterical and out of control. It was the perfect narrative for him. He was the calm, rational husband dealing with a difficult, emotional wife. After Queen Isabella's death, Philip's campaign intensified. He and Ferdinand were now direct rivals for control of Castile. Philip's entire political strategy rested on the idea that he should be king, not just regent. To make that happen, he needed the Castilian Cortes to declare Juana incompetent. He spread rumors, exaggerated her behavior, and presented himself as the only viable ruler. He was the first person to see the political utility of calling Juana mad. He created the template that her father and her son would later follow. He may have loved her in his own way, but he loved power more, and he was willing to sacrifice his wife's reputation and freedom to get it. Number 2, was she trapped in a political marriage? Juana's life was decided for her before she was even an adult. She was the third child of Ferdinand and Isabella, the Catholic monarchs of Spain. In the grand chess game of European politics, the children of kings and queens were the most valuable pieces. Their marriages were not about love or personal happiness. They were about forging alliances, securing borders, and consolidating power. Juana's marriage to Philip the Handsome, son of the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I, was the cornerstone of her parents' foreign policy. Its goal was to create a Spanish-Habsburg alliance against their common rival France. From the moment the marriage contract was signed in 1495, Juana's fate was sealed. She was shipped off to Flanders in 1496, a teenager in a foreign land whose language and customs were completely alien to her. She was expected to be a dutiful wife, produce heirs, and represent Spanish interests at the Burgundian court. It was a job, not a romance. The problem was that Juana fell in love. By all accounts, she was captivated by her handsome, charming husband. But Philip never reciprocated that level of emotional investment. For him, she was his Spanish bride, the key to a powerful alliance and, eventually, a kingdom. This fundamental imbalance created a toxic dynamic. Juana craved the loyalty and affection of a loving husband. Philip sought the freedom of a powerful duke. Her emotional needs were a liability in a world of cold political calculation. This was not just a bad marriage, it was a political trap. Juana had no one to turn to. In Flanders, she was surrounded by Philip's court, people whose loyalty was to him. She was isolated from her own family and her Spanish advisors. When Philip betrayed her, she had no support system. Her distress and anger had no outlet except for the emotional outbursts that would later be used against her. She was a stranger in a strange land, married to a man who used her love for him as a tool for his own ambition. Furthermore, her role as a political wife put her in an impossible position. She was supposed to be loyal to her husband, but also to her parents and to Spain. When the political interests of Spain and Burgundy clashed, as they often did, she was caught in the middle. Philip pressured her to side with him against her father. Her father expected her to influence Philip for the benefit of Spain. She was constantly being pulled in two directions. The stress was immense. The tragedy of Juana's marriage is that it was designed for political stability, but it created intense personal instability. She was set up to be dependent on a man who was not dependable. She was placed in a situation that would naturally provoke jealousy, anxiety, and anger. And then, when she expressed those very natural emotions, she was punished for them. Her marriage was the cage that was built for her long before Tordesillas became her prison. Number one was she set up from the start. Juana was born into a world of immense privilege and even greater pressure. As the daughter of Isabella and Ferdinand, she received an education that was extraordinary for a woman of her time. She studied Latin, music, law, and theology. She was intelligent, serious, and devout. In her early years, there was no hint of any mental instability. She was a promising young princess, one of several children who were all pawns in their parents' grand strategy. She was not originally destined to rule. Her older brother Juan was the heir. After him came her older sister, Isabella. Juana was third in line. Her role was supposed to be simpler, marry a foreign prince and secure an alliance. But then fate intervened. Her brother Juan died in 1497, her sister Isabella died in 1498, and her infant son Miguel died in 1500. In the space of 3 years, a series of tragedies catapulted Juana from a minor princess to the heir of the most powerful throne in Europe. This was not a blessing. It was a catastrophe that put her directly in the crosshairs of the most ambitious men in her world. Suddenly, her marriage to Philip was no longer just an alliance. It was the union that would determine the future of Spain. This shift changed everything. As a minor princess, her passionate nature might have been seen as a personal quirk. As the future Queen of Castile, it was seen as a dangerous political liability. The pressure on her intensified 100-fold. She was now a prize to be controlled. Her husband, Philip, saw his path to a crown. Her father, Ferdinand, saw the potential loss of the kingdom he had spent his life building. Her upbringing, for all its academic rigor, had not prepared her for this. She was raised to be pious and dutiful. She was not trained to navigate the treacherous waters of international power politics, especially when the main players were her own husband and father. She was an intelligent woman, but she was emotionally unprepared for the betrayals that were to come. She expected loyalty from her family. She received manipulation and ambition instead. She was set up not by a single conspiracy, but by a series of circumstances. The deaths of her siblings set her up to be queen. Her political marriage set her up for heartbreak and isolation. Her own passionate, trusting nature set her up to be exploited by men who were more cynical and power-hungry than she was. From the moment she became the heir, her life was no longer her own. She became a symbol, a vessel for the crown of Castile. And the people closest to her decided that they wanted the crown, but not the woman who wore it. Her story was written before she had a chance to live it. She was not born mad, but she was born into a world that had every reason to make her so.